She's a member of the Calcutta Research Group. She is best known for her work on gender and migration, forced migration, especially women in the borderlands. Is something she has focused on in her empirical, but also in her theoretical work. She is currently also president of the International Association for Studies in Forced Migration. She served as the Vice Chancellor of the Sanskrit College and University in Calcutta, and I'm very happy that she is no longer Vice Chancellor so that she can devote herself fully to her research work and come up with even more publications of the kind that we have seen from her. She's edited the really, really important volume on stable populations, anxious states, also edited a volume on women in borderlands, and the most recent one on statelessness in South Asia. She's one of the editors of Refugee Watch, which is a journal I think that everybody who's with us on the program today should familiarize themselves with. And she has been a visiting professor in many, many universities, including Helsinki in Finland, Yunnan University in China, University of Paris 7, and the New School in New York. I'll ask her to begin today on the panel, followed by Nasreen Chowdhury, who teaches at the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. She joins us from Delhi. She has completed her PhD in political science from McGill University in Canada, and has been also working for many years on the questions of forced migration, refugees, citizenship. Her most recent book is on refugees, citizenship, and belonging, contested terrains, came out a couple of years ago. And last year, the edited volume on deterritorialized identities, transborder movement in South Asia. And this year, actually, a book which I have not yet had a look at, Citizenship, Nationalism, and Refugeehood of Rohingyas in Southern Asia. She has also been working, like Paula, on questions of gender identities, and migration in India. That's a forthcoming volume which she and Paula have put together. And she is also a member of the Calcutta Research Group. Our final speaker on the panel will be Shramata Bishwas. She teaches English at the Sanskrit College and University in Calcutta. And so she comes at the whole question of pedagogy and teaching from a literary studies angle. And her doctoral dissertation was on the body cultures of contemporary India and public health. She has been working also on questions of migration and gender, looking at them in a larger project funded by the Western Sydney University, and is mapping Calcutta at the moment as a sanitary city historically built upon caste-specific migrant labor and negotiating questions of access or the lack of access. She is a member of the editorial board of Refugee Watch as well, and she runs the blog Refugee Watch Online. And this year, Women Unlimited in India has published her co-edited volume, Situating Social Media, Gender, Caste, Solidarity, and Protest, so addressing much larger questions of the intersections between gender and caste, and looking at the politics of protest. So thanks all three of you for being with us today on the panel. I think I'll give the word to each of you for maybe 7 to 8 minutes. Maybe I'll remind you after 5 minutes, if you are looking at me, that it's time to wind up, and then I'll go in for a discussion among all three of you, and then open out immediately to Q&A from our viewers. For those of you who are listening to us, please use the chat function. I'll be monitoring it with your questions, and then I can either read them out or give you the word as time permits. So thank you very much. And with that, I hand over to Paula. Paula, you need to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shalini. You know, I always say that your friends should actually introduce you, because their introduction is always so good that you get an extra energy to speak in this sort of a forum. And these forums are very difficult because, you know, when you are in front of a live audience, you sort of get a feel by looking at the people as to how you are communicating. The whole purpose for a speaker is to communicate. And when we can't see you, it becomes that much more difficult. But anyway, let us dive into the topic for today, and that is pedagogy. Now, first, one disclaimer, and that is I feel that pedagogy in terms of post-migration studies is how to teach research to people, or how to teach people to do research in post-migration studies. Since time is very short, I will do a couple of pointers on that. Since this is an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or as I call it, an undisciplined field of study, therefore, you know, if we sort of try to bring it into a pedagogical field, you know, that is acceptable for grading and, you know, in a structured syllabi within a university system, then we lose much. Because what happens is we are losing the possibility of constant evolution. In an MA program, you need a syllabi to guide you. But a field like forced migration has to be constantly responding to events that are happening, because it is a field where events are constantly taking over us. Even consider lockdown, consider, you know, the state system that has evolved a system of lockdown whereby it has completely restricted our movements. But by restricting borders, by restricting movements, it has actually created multiple movements. And if we are not able to respond to that, we cannot proceed as you know, a researcher, a person involved in pedagogy and forced migration. So I will begin with what has been called, to be a good researcher in the field of forced migration studies, you have to be disloyal to civilization. So you cannot actually accept what is meant by loyalty. This is not my word, it's Adrian Rich's word. But I believe in that, you know. So you cannot actually comply to established norms, establish modes of loyalty. You have to be disloyal to your field. You have to bring in many methodological engagements to find out about life. So I will, you know, as a continuation to that, I will talk about what I mean by doing research in this field. Because whenever we are talking of research, the first word that comes to our minds is archive. Starting from Habermas to Antoinette Burton, everybody talks of archives. But what is the archive for research in post-migration studies? It is actually the people, you know, that you're working with. So here again, I will come to the next transgression. The next transgression is a transgression of hierarchies that is built in research. Whenever we are doing research, we have a power relationship. The researcher always thinks that the power lies with her, but that is not true. That is where we have to transgress. We have to be disloyal to the maxim that you have to do objective research. I don't believe you can do objective research because you cannot objectify human experiences. So, research is always guided, good research is always guided by your politics, your intentions, your modes of empowering, and your experiences. So, again, I will bring in another very interesting declaration in terms of research by Carley, who says that you cannot be a tourist in research. You have to be a wanderer who wanders with a group of people. So, you have to share experiences. You have to learn as a researcher in the field of forced migration. You can never accept the fact that power is with you. No, you are actually within a knowledge community, and the power lies with the interviewee. Your research is as good as the empathy that you build up with the interviewee, and it is a shared experience. So you have to, something is going on.
Someone needs to switch off their mics.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Now we can. Perfect.
Okay, lovely. So, transgressions. So you have to be transgressive, and this transgression is very problematic because you have to transgress your own boundaries. So you have to make yourself understand that a researcher in forced migration studies is as good as I said, her empathy sharing, her respect for the interviewee. The third thing is, in forced migration studies, field, you have to understand that you cannot make people say things. So it's not just consent, it is beyond consent. It is something that, your knowledge base has to be from a knowledge community, and by respectfully accepting the borders of that knowledge community, that knowledge sharing, can you do good research in forced migration studies. So you cannot transgress boundaries set up by your researcher. And I always feel good forced migration studies has to be feminist, because as a feminist, you disturb all kinds of set hierarchies. You do not accept the fact that research can only be done if you are objective. To a feminist, a research is always subjective, and a research is always guided by her own pedagogical inclinations and her own politics. So I think as a researcher, you have to be feminist and disturb the set norms, the set boundaries of understanding, of knowledge sharing, etc. And then I will come to my last point, because I think I've exhausted almost 6 minutes. My last point will be your own. My goodness, some our Malavia is constantly switching off her or switching on her microphone. So please do something about it. Um, Now, the thing is, a researcher can do all of this and yet not be a good researcher, because this is a and you have to have a goal of empowerment. Your research has to empower communities. You cannot think that you will be laid back, you will be sort of distanced from a community and do good research. Ronabida has very interestingly posed a question about militant research. I think research in forced migration has to be militant research. And you have to be a participant in this community. You have to empower yourself as a researcher. To empower yourself as a researcher, you have to empower the audience that you're working with. Because as I said, you're not a tourist to look at things, but you're a wanderer. You're within a group who are wandering together, who are migrating together. So if your interviewees are not empowered as a result of your research, then to me, that sort of a research is fruitless. Thank you so much, Shalini. Shalini, you're muted. Shalini, you're muted.
I unmute myself. Thanks so much. Paula, you've raised a host of methodological issues. some very close to my heart as an anthropologist, in any case, very close to the kinds of participatory fieldwork research methods which we have been using as a discipline, some much more specific to the question of post-migration. We'll come to those in a moment. Let me first give the word to Nasreen, and then to Shamata, and then we come to some larger questions. Nasreen.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Shalini. I really appreciate the opportunity that I can do it actually from the confines of my room. I'm going to just concentrate on some of the questions that Ronabida had posed. I think that was a good starting point. And I think Paula has very rightfully, stroked some of them. And I think somewhere, since all of us are, on a familiar ground, and we are talking about research and, the subjecthood of refugee studies. So I think somewhere the sense of responsibility that we often, encounter vis-a-vis the refugee subject is something very important that all of us carry it to the field. So my discussion, or my just couple of points, I will just concentrate on 2-3 things. One is, I think, what Ronabida said about the ethical, aspect of it. Something that we talk about, we do, grapple with it, but I think I want to bring that out in a central, the focus right here. And the second is whether the field of, refugee studies and migration studies, how well are we informed of the question of positionality? And I think Paula has really touched mostly on those, but to go back to the first question of the ethical question, I remember when I was doing my fieldwork, or rather when I came from McGill to do fieldwork in India, into southern part of India, in Tamil Nadu, the first thing I was asked about, well, whether these are human subjects. So, you need to do do's and don'ts and all kinds of stuff. And at that point, I remember being like, oh, really? I mean, at least we are very careful. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. But there are certain norms, certain rules, and there these essential aspects of these rules and norms actually quite help us understand and draw up a sort of a boundary that enable us as a researcher to do the field and construct the field and constitute the field in one way. And when we are constituting the field, we are also trying to figure out the boundaries of interaction with the interview, the interview and the interview relation that often happens. Now, in refugee studies and migration studies is very, very interdisciplinary. So we are kind of, borrowing very heavily, and my work is very informed by the anthropological study of, I talk about state, I talk about human nature, and a whole lot of stuff. So I think somewhere the question of whether we actually should allow our, the refugee question to be determined to a point that we are kind of either disempowering them or empowering the refugee subject. I think that is a very, very important critical question. And in fact, I remember my first fieldwork when I came down. In most of those, the Sri Lankan Tamil refugees thought I was part of some, official agenda or official government, work. And I still have those letters of, application they had given. And at that point, I remember feeling very, very small that, here we are trying to gather information on a subject that I feel very close to, but however, you're not able to, return back as much as possible. So this ethical question is as to how far one can push the boundary and how far one should actually give a certain degree of hope. That becomes very, very critical question for in migration studies. And I think some of these questions are very, very central, and sometimes we need to actually have a certain degree of training, because it then helps us to kind of delimit ourselves to a point that we can suggest that, look, it's only this far we can go. Now, the second point is a question of positionality. I mean, of course, it's not possible that, somewhere we stay away from the refugee subject and we kind of feel that, you want to be objective. I don't think, and I completely agree with Paula here, because as feminist scholars, I think somewhere we have attempted to muddy the ground a lot, because unless you muddy the ground, you don't necessarily get into the heart of the matter. And once we go into the heart of the matter, then it becomes even more responsible to, how does one then, what are the takeaways from the field? When the field is situated within the work that we are doing, and I remember one of the readings of Jennifer Heinemann on this one, that how do you construe the field? How do you kind of connect in the field? And how does the refugee subject essentially, interconnect with this field and even as a researcher? So these dual relation that exists between the refugee subject and the researcher at one hand, and the idea that the kind of information that is given and what do we do with the information, as to how far do we actually take this information back and utilize it in our own work without necessarily giving a sense of, let's say, that, okay, something will change for them on the ground. Now, this uncertainty that anything is not likely to change also has a certain kind of a toll on the researcher. So that's my second point, actually. Now, one other aspect, I think one of the questions that Ronabita had also raised, like the series of questions, and I'm sure you remember some of them has been, it's been circulated well. The question is, how do we, construe or, the narratives of conflict and trauma? So in other words, why is it that we focus on, the stories of like where there are stories where there's a lot of hurt, where there's a lot of the question of trauma? How do we best present it without necessarily getting into it in one sense, when of course one cannot do it otherwise? So the question therefore is, as from the standpoint of feminism, how does one then navigate this terrain? Because navigating this terrain is actually one of the huge tasks that all researchers actually, are engaging with while investigating at the field. While you are interviewing, you'll unravel stories of not only just domestic violence, but all kinds of violence at one level. And the second is the idea that how do you, in one way, is it possible to actually empower the refugee subject? Is it really possible to do that over a period of time? Because the moment we are moving away from the field is again reshaping the refugee subject once more. So I think somewhere the issue becomes even more problematic as to where do we draw the line, because sometimes it is important to kind of bring that question out in the front and engage with it, and therefore be informed. Because once we're able to engage and inform, and perhaps then maybe we can empower at one level. Because somewhere the whole specter of migrants, I mean, yesterday we were talking about Ronabita's book, that and I really like that when he says, the nation creates two subjects. So when we talk, it's on a similar vein, the construction of this refugee question, how do we navigate this? How do we kind of, transgress this boundary at one level? And if we are transgressing this boundary, then are we able to do it in a formal way or in an informal way? If it is in an informal manner, then the question is, are they really being empowered enough to question the basis of hierarchy that exists? Even, let's say, most refugees are staying in camps. So are they able to navigate the question of hierarchy in camps? Are they able to navigate the question of administrative structure that exists? Because often what happens is, in some way, they are stuck in a state of limbo, and we as a researcher just go there as onlooker. In some sense, we do our bit, and once we finish, we are coming back. Now, once we come back, of course, we carry our own tales, own stories, own bag full of interviews, of the tapes and so on and so forth. But I think somewhere the story should not end there. The story should continue, and the journey should continue at that level. I'll end here, Shalini. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nasreen. You've opened up two ethical questions. We'll come back to those during the fieldwork, also those ethical questions persist beyond the field in writing up our research. I think we will talk about the textual part of some of these issues with Shamata's presentation, and also, of course, the question of positionality and the boundary transgression issue, which we have taken over also with us into the discussion with Paula. So let me give Shamata the word first, and then I'll pose a few questions to you. I have one or two questions from the audience as well.
Thank you. I will quickly read out what I wrote down last night and this morning, much of what I want to say. So I'll quickly read it out. As part of the workshop on migration and forced migration studies, of which this panel is also a part, I have been coordinating a module on gender and other vulnerabilities with specific reference to COVID-19 and migrants. We just concluded 2 of its sessions. In the final session, we screened a documentary on LGBTQ refugees seeking resettlement and asylum in the US. 4 such refugees were tracked in the course of the film. Their interviews of their advocates, sponsors, and fictional recreation of their trials and tribulations in their homelands that necessitated their seeking refuge, all of these form the content of the film. A documentary is not something unusual to include in a course on migration. In fact, for as long as I can remember, workshops and teachers and facilitators have been making extensive use of the documentary format, since the documentary is supposed to provide the viewer with information and with facts. But our discussion showed that the film operates by preventing certain people: the Syrian man who could pass as a straight man and is good looking, then the lesbian couple from Angola who fit the heteronormative couplehood bill, and that the politics of the film, despite being a documentary, ties in closely with the Hollywood attitude towards Islamic terrorism. The documentary and the discussions around it helped us learn about LGBTQ refugee lives, the process of seeking asylum, but also allowed us to pay attention to the narrative technique, the convenient use of heightened emotion, and the circularity of its structure. This is where I would like to come in. On this discussion surrounding pedagogy in migration and refugee studies, my intervention would be in the field of media and cultural texts relating to and centering on migration. As a teacher of English in a small liberal arts university in India, each of my designations speak for the post-coloniality of my situation. Teaching English at a university, over the last few years, our curriculum has seen the inclusion of a series of texts that deal with colonialism, imperialism, and nation formation. One of them is a dedicated discipline specific elective course on partition texts that explores poems, stories, novels, and films related to the partition of British India, written immediately after the partition, 20 years down the line, and 50 years down the line. I will mention 2 of the things I had to confront when teaching the course before the semester was interrupted by the coronavirus induced lockdown. 1. How do we talk about a time of exceptional communal tension while living through another time of similarly exceptional and state sponsored communal violence? Second, how do we address issues of nation formation and citizenship at a time when our citizenship in India is dubious under the recent Citizenship Amendment Act? Again, this flags 2 things, or maybe 3 things, that I consider to be crucial for the teacher and researcher in refugee and migration studies. First, the subjectivity of the teacher and the students. In this case, we were all on the same boat to some extent. All our citizenships were being questioned, and I don't think there was anyone in the class who felt that we were doing fine regarding the state of affairs in our country. But many of the students also narrated incidents from their families' histories, an inheritance of loss and trauma in which I did not have a share. Second, there was certain leeway in dealing with narratives of partition. Being a literature course, everything that we dealt with was fictional. So, not technically facts, but trickier because we had to reckon with the politics of representation, questions of signification, and aesthetics. This probably allowed us to ask more pertinent questions whose answers do not lie in the annals of history or the tenets of political science about the meanings of home and homelessness, about the spectacular ability of common people to resort to violence and to also show empathy, the experience of the journey, the collective silencing of violence against women, the slow unveiling of that silence through oral narratives 40 years later, and many such which have not yet been captured in social science works. A third concern was the inherently interdisciplinary nature of the field. How do we provide a grounding in the bare facts of the events of the partition in keeping with the fictional representations we are handling? How do we teach two films to a class of literature students, keeping in mind the distinct tools necessary for the different mediums? In other courses, the challenges have been no less complex, although a bit more distant from ourselves. We have talked about the long partition and repeated displacement of the Dalits in West Bengal in Amitav Ghosh's novel The Hungry Tide, about colonialism in South Africa through Olive Schreiner's novel The Story of an African Farm, about Australian colonialism and the discovery of the bush via Patrick White's novel Voss, about the silences that hide slave trade, which was the foundation of British respectability, in Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, about transatlantic slave trade and plantationocene in Afro-Ben's Orinoco, etc. And these are all things that I have taught in a year. So my colleagues have done so much more. Recently, because I was invited to it, I came across a course, the, a course on migrant media run at the University of Wisconsin-Madison by Darshana Sridharmini. Her course is titled Media, Diaspora and Migrant Imaginations. It collects together, I quote, both media produced by the migrants as well as media representations that draws synergy from the debates around refugee rights and integration policies. Media practices become intricately woven into such mobilities as they can serve both as sites of resistance as well as spaces where regressive binaries are further consolidated. End quote. Resistance is another reason why I find and perhaps our students find narratives of migration so compelling. Resistance as a function of power, but also creative, imaginative, and myriad. The raped refugee woman who chooses to have her child, the diasporic woman who refuses the clutches of her culture to create a new radical identity, the child in the camps who learns to fly paper planes with letters on them, and in very few instances, the collective action of building colonies and caring for others. Closer home in India, we find so many instances of such assemblages that are making inroads into popular culture. In the southern state of Kerala, we come across a film called CIA, Comrade in America, a popular romance in which the protagonist tries to sneak into the USA through the Mexico border. Despite its romanticizing, the gun toting human traffickers, the dead heat of the Sonoran desert, and the trigger happy border patrol leave deep resonances in the mind of the viewer who, like me, was only hoping to gaze adoringly at Dulkar Salman's beauty. Engaging with migrant media, we need to remember that the popular is hardly the avant garde, and the popular is almost never radical. But since the phobia against migrants is part of the popular imaginary, it might be also very necessary to take the popular seriously in the classroom and as a research subject. Before I finish, I have only one comment, one additional comment, and that is about the migrant herself as a researcher. And I think of migration memoirs written by women across the world. I submit that we should think of these memoirs as autoethnographies. In the act of remembering and writing down, they are also placing themselves in the currents of history, inextricably tying their lives with major movements of their time. And it is imperative that we don't marginalize these texts in favor of only ethnography or political science or history when we study migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much, Shamata. So I have a couple of questions, as I said, from the panel, but from the audience. But let me first try to just pose 2 or 3 questions to all 3 of you, which may tie in some of the strands of the presentations that you have made. I think one question which emerges for me is everyone is referring to the field, and I think the field here is being referred to in 2 senses. One, forced migration as a field of studies, but the other field is the field in which one does research, right? And here, of course, the one of the challenges is the constantly shifting nature of the field, both the field as in the multidisciplinary field of forced migration studies, but also the field because you are tracking, mapping, and wandering with people who are being forced to be mobile, to leave homes, to settle, to unsettle, to resettle. So I think you have, in a double sense, a field which is constantly changing, which you need to map. Now, that is inherently in tension with any kind of syllabus that you may want to impose upon it for the purpose of teaching. So I think that's a tension that it would be interesting to address in all your work. And in anthropology, there was a huge discussion on the boundaries of the field. What is the field? How does one construct the field? Because the field itself is never given. So if we are following people, we may want to construct the boundaries of the field along with the where life takes them. But the question is, what order must you impose on this unruly mobility in order to have a bounded object? Because you cannot study completely unbounded objects. You have to have some kind of sense of where the limits to your inquiry will be set by you. And so what are the kinds of criteria we would use to then bound the field for our studies? That is one set of questions. The other, I think, which is very important, that all three of you raise, is the question of empowering or disempowering, and the question of power hierarchies as part of research. What is interesting for me is how this question of power translates then into voice and authority in the text itself. So if you can, one is engaged in dialogical research, but in what ways is the text going to be dialogical when it comes to writing up that research? So Shamata suggests taking migrant memoirs seriously as autoethnography, but this is giving over voice completely then to the migrant subject. And the question is there anything in between where it's not autoethnography and not a narrative in which the voice of the migrant is silenced or marginalized, but what kind of dialogical forms has the field of forced migration studies experimented with in this connection? And the third question, I think, so there's a question of the syllabus, there's the question of power and voice, both from the research context to the written context, the text or the documentary. And the documentary can also have different kinds of narratives, which can be in the first person, but they can also evolve into a more interesting kind of dialogical narrative. But what kinds are there? And the third question, I think, which all of you raise, is the question of the ethics of doing field work, of responsibility, of accountability. Whom are we responsible and accountable to? And what kinds of reciprocity are possible in the field and also later? And the question is, what would count, in a sense, as being accountable to the subjects whose lives we are sharing and then also writing about. So let me leave you with these questions to begin the discussion among yourselves. Just let me know who wants to pick up a point, and then I have a set of questions from the audience, which I'll take up in a minute. Paula, do you want to begin? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. You talk about syllabus. That is always constricting. And as you clearly said, that it always imposes limits. So a syllabus, that's why I find a subject, I can't even call a subject, but a field like forced migration is so much more challenging, because I think it's impossible to put it in a syllabus. That's why I said the most that we can aspire to is to tell people how to do research in the field. You know, for basic knowledge, There are texts, yesterday we discussed one of the foundational texts. So, there are texts, but, but to make it into a field and to have a syllabi, a series of syllabuses is constricting. And the only thing that we can do is to be honest about it. We will know that the moment we are constructing the syllabi, the whole process of destruction begins, because you're no longer representing the truth that even emerges to you. And so that is why, trying to be somebody who designs research on forced migration studies is not just the work of a facilitator. The person has to be an alchemist. And we know that the field of alchemy is fraught with, so many disappointments. So, so given that, we will just, have to we will have to stick to honesty and say that this is what we are doing. We are actually freezing a mobile subject. And by freezing it, we are catching it in time. So it's both spatial and temporal. And the truth, the so-called truth that we are trying to approximate is always a false truth. Because by the time we go to approximate whatever, it becomes a false narrative. So, the most that we can do is not to teach our students, but to sensitize our students through our honesty. And yes, it is very, very problematic to disturb power hierarchies. One of my icons, bell hooks, have tried to do that in terms of pedagogy, but we have seen that whenever we embark on a research, there is a power hierarchy. So how do you disturb that? In my case, I always say, be prepared to say that the power does not lie with me. So I am just a recipient, but a recipient of knowledge. So, my archives are actually knowledge groups or knowledge communities. So, I do not think that there is this higher archive from where you can learn. You can only problematize the problematic, and then you can try to tease certain strands out by realizing that the power hierarchy exists, and you can try to disturb that hierarchy. Again, beyond that, you're very limited. And but the one thing that we can do is to accept the responsibility. For better or for worse, we have to accept that we are responsible. So, therein comes the question of ethics, to be honest about your responsibility, to be honest about, your own intention to play God, probably, and knowingly that is actually a false premise. So you have to be very honest about your responsibility. And, and whatever you can, you have to plow back, because you are working. And there's again a very important question that my sister today raised, and that is, do the dead have rights? This is something that we have to sort of face, confront every day. So, I think that the important phrase you very rightly pointed out, Shalini, in this whole research is this notion of responsibility.
Thank you so much, Paula. Nasreen, Shamita, anybody who wants to come in on either of these before I read out some of the other questions which are specifically addressed to you?
Just come in very quickly, because I don't think I'm going to last very long. So yeah, I think you've kind of muddied it even better, I think, Shalini, in some way, because when we talk about the field, I think that's a very important question. What is the field? How do we kind of establish certain kind of boundaries within the field itself, and are we taking a piece of the field when we leaving the field also? And if we are, then what do we choose to do with it? And are we really in some way able to even set the in some way be responsible enough to talk a little bit or discuss a little bit, or beyond our research arena, in terms of the hierarchy of that is well established within the field itself. So the question therefore is, where is the field? The field is, I think, exactly where the refugee subject belongs, and where I think in some sense where along with the refugee is also the researcher. So it's an interaction that really takes place between the researcher, or just basically the interviewer and the interviewer at that level. But the question therefore becomes, then, if there are ethical questions, then who is transgressing those ethical questions at which point in time? And what do we choose to do after the story is being told? So I think I still remember, like, and this was, I think, really a while ago, even as a grad student, that, what do we choose to do with the field after the work is done, is something is so well entrenched in our mind that the field is always being constituted at some level or the other. So in some way, I think that's why I also wanted to talk about, when we talk about research, migration and refugee research, there is a degree of huge possibility of interdisciplinarity. And this interdisciplinarity actually helps us, enables and facilitates our information, and how we choose to kind of, question positionality at one level, talk about empowerment at one level, and at the same time, we are also getting informed and enriched, as a researcher ourselves. So I think it's a twin process that is happening simultaneously. And as Paula mentioned, I think the sense of responsibility is very, very, along with responsibility, I think the process of accountability is very, very important. So that we don't necessarily presume and give a sense that everything will change. And as I said, I still have the letters that were, in boxes, which were, like petition that was given, thinking that, this person belongs to such government agency or whatnot. So something will change. Now, this sense of responsibility, I think somewhere, in some sense, needs to translate into the narrative that we actually draw away from the field, so that we are able to locate the field again in the work that we are representing, in the stories that is being told and not so told. So untold stories that needs to be kind of accounted for and narrated in a particular way. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamata.
Yes. So in August and September, I interacted briefly with a filmmaker who's making a film called An Insignia of a Forced Winter. He was talking to a Rohingya refugee in Delhi, and he tracks his journey in Delhi from talking to UNHCR, and as b- as an activist, and also his home being burned down in one of the slums, to his courtship with a Rohingya woman in a Bangladesh camp, and they get married online. They go back. He travels back to Bangladesh, and our filmmaker follows him. And I'm giving this example because one. One of the things that really baffled the people who were watching his trailer and interacting with him was, what is the ethics of your participation in this person's life? There are certain extremely important moments of personal privileged interaction which you are accessing because it is happening online, and I will come back to this when I talk about a bit about digital ethnography. Uh, but where does the ethic lie in representing it? How do you represent it in the most impartial yet in the most empathetic way? I don't know, and we could not reach a conclusion as to the way this documentary filmmaker has made his film has been empathetic to his subject or not. But yes, it is a question of empathy, and it's I wouldn't so but I also wouldn't say that the autoethnography is the only way to go, because there is a role that the researcher fulfills in the world, which may not be the role that her research subject fulfills in the world. But in the process of knowledge production, we are both stakeholders, And as a reluctant ethnographer, because I am shy to talk to people I do not know, and I also am so acutely conscious of my relative position of ease and comfort, that I don't know how to talk to people in my sites. As a reluctant ethnographer, I think there are ways and means. There are, yesterday we were discussing the marginal nation, and that is probably one of the ways in which one does it. With the narrative itself engages so intensely and so emotionally with the people that the narrative displays, that it becomes something more than a mere document of their experiences. It becomes a participant in their experiences, one that privileges their voices, although in no way taking away from the critical and the analytical zeal of the researcher. Uh, that is all, except that one thing I wanted to add, which is the ethics of ethnography is becoming more and more difficult as much of our ethnography moves online. As field migration studies scholars participate in apps and sites and chat rooms where migrants congregate, where migrants use to talk to people back home or to even find out routes along which they will migrate. It's a shadowy zone which is not always legal or illegal. And the researcher often has the privilege of being a fly on the wall, unprecedented access, much more than she would have had she actually had to go to a refugee camp or follow migrants along their route. So, what does the researcher do with this unprecedented digital access? I don't know. I don't know the answer to it, but it is something. Our ethical responsibility as a researcher becomes so much more when we have more and more access. That is all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Nasreen, I know you are fading out. So if I may give you, I mean, it's a heroic act that you are with us today, given how unwell you have been. But so can I just give you two questions which are specifically directed to you? And then I think you may want to call it a day and just take some rest, or are you up to it?
Sure, go ahead.
So the one question for you is from Sucharita Shengupta. She's writing saying, wondering aloud on the question of empowerment of refugees that you have raised, how far is it possible to talk about trauma of their life experiences and still not adhere to the idea of a powerless victimhood narrative? That is, how to balance the question of agency while not undermining the importance of power hierarchies. So this is the tension between attributing agency and thinking of a lot of these refugees as powerless victims. So she's saying how to balance the question of agency while not undermining the importance of power hierarchies in a settlement like a camp, and the ways the life of a refugee often transgresses the legal boundaries set up by the state. And the second question to you is from my colleague Aisha Chala here, who is asking about the question of narratives and trauma, which you raised. She's asking, what do you think about the problem of tackling these, that is the questions of narratives and trauma, without inscribing this trope of trauma on the refugees, which could easily take us into the domain of singling out a particular kind of experience and thus reducing their subjectivities? So those are the two very direct questions to you. And then we'll turn to the others.
Thank you so much. That's really kind of you. And you're absolutely correct. I am fading out, but I think these are excellent questions. It makes my why. I mean, it's worthwhile at that level. I'll club them together in some way so that in a way, Shucharita's question actually sets a tone, saying that we do when we are mapping their voices in some sense, and we are zoning into certain kind of events, significant events that has taken place, we are juxtaposing this whole question of powerlessness and the question of empowerment and imposing the issue of agency at some level. So I think all of it is being unraveled while we are away from the field. This is important task. I remember, as grad students, and I'm sure you will agree that, when you're unraveling the suitcase full of field and when you are discussing the narrative and you're figuring out the narrative, you have to pick and choose. Unfortunately, that picking and choosing is also happening while we are writing. So the field is, in a way, is being reconstructed again in our own living room or whatever that room that we are. So that's the positionality question that we need to deal with, because we don't deal with that. And often, the stories which in some sense which we think is most significant, that will add to the thesis, okay, or it will add weightage. So a lot of things kind of weave into the question of whether we are doing a adequate job. I won't say good or bad job. I don't think that's a way to go about. But are we doing an adequate job in a responsible way of bringing all the sides, all the shades, there in the narrative at that level? And that is where I think I'll bring in, which in Aisha's question also, that it's absolutely correct that when we are juxtaposing narrative and we are picking and choosing a kind of a trauma, we are making that judgment call. We are making that, and somewhere that judgment call is something that we should not be doing. I think that is where the subjectivity is something is emerging very, very strongly. And in somewhere, I think the whole idea of, objectiveness does not exist at that level. And having, as part of the training, if it does not exist, you're not able to do it, then how do we navigate it? And at the same time, the task is for us in some way to allow the question of agency, allow the question of empowerment to be central to the theme. So somewhere I don't think there is an easy answer to these questions, because these are something that we are experiencing while we are unraveling the field away from the field again. And each researcher is navigating it in some sense, or in more than one way or the other. So let's say somebody who's working on gender will have one way of looking at it, and somebody who is doing, let's say, just mapping, migration movement and in a way giving a particular trajectory, they will have a very different take altogether. So I think somewhere the methodological training actually helps us in kind of tying all of that together in some way, and perhaps be truthful to the refugee question. I won't say subject, to the refugee question itself, and to the migrant body that we are so well, taking it apart in some sense and then bringing it back together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nasreen. And as I said, please feel free to switch off and rest. And thank you very, very much for having joined us at all, despite your health issues. So I'm wishing you a very speedy recovery. And thanks once again. And please don't feel obliged to stay on. You've already gone beyond the call of duty to CRG and to the refugee question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Paula, let me turn to you with a couple of questions which are directly addressed to you. Some are general questions, so feel free to pick up whatever you would like to pick up. We have a good half an hour left for discussion, so I have 5 sets of questions here. The first is from Shomali Bhattacharya, directly to Paula, saying, as a forced migration researcher, while conducting an interview with a subject, how can one avoid starting from a position of power? So the second question is also connected to the question of power, but in a reverse fashion, if you like, from Prabhu, saying, is empowerment a really good measure of research? So I think this is something we also need to think about. What is empowerment the best, or is a good criteria for thinking about research? And then a question from Aisha also to Paula. Don't we need to unpack the concept of empowerment further, especially in a context where the concept of empowerment has become a major concept in the humanitarian industries? Yes, so let me stop there, and then I can give the second set of questions. And Shamata, please feel free to come in whenever, just signal to me. Paula. Paula, you need to unmute yourself, I think.
Yeah, I was so busy writing it down that I did not realize that I'm muted. I'm seldom muted, so it is quite an experience. No, I I will begin actually with Nasreen's. I wish she was here, but anyway, me and Nasreen constantly have conversations. So with what she said, in terms, and what you said, Shalini, in terms of field, I'm going to be a little more transgressive. I will say that the field is you. The field is the researcher. The researcher's politics shape the field. The researcher imposes the boundaries. The researcher chooses the research that they want to do. So actually the field is constructed by the researcher. And so it is the researcher that is the field, very frankly. From there, I will go to this question of power hierarchies. Shomali, very frankly, power really doesn't lie with the interviewer. That is a false construction that we always do when we are, because the interviewer is the privileged person. And it is from privilege that we draw power, the sense of power. But the power lies completely with the person who you are interviewing. You seek that person out because you want that person to answer certain questions that would primarily benefit you. So in terms of that, you are a consumer. That person is the person who is producing the knowledge. So I don't see why there is this problem. The problem is a false problem because of your sense of entitlement. As I said, your entitlement comes with the sense of you being the field, you asking the questions, but you are actually seeking knowledge like a consumer. You're asking for commodities because you're commodifying the answers. So my submission is, you as a researcher will have to understand that you cannot commodify life's experiences, and you will be, you will very honestly have to understand that in this case you are the student, and that person is giving you knowledge that you take back for your own purposes. Yes, I think empowerment it's not the only thing. And, as Aisha said, one has to completely unpack this whole notion of empowerment, because I was certainly not thinking in terms of, what humanitarian institutes do. And, I've always been a very staunch critique of empowerment coming from humanitarian institutions or from anywhere, because I think empowerment is a personal experience. What I was trying to say is, your intention has to plow back your knowledge into something that would be catalytic, that would be able to change the lives of the people that you're working on, who are in your mind subjects of your study. You have to try to make their lives more transgressive, their ability to be more questioning, their ability to access power, their ability to access rights, their ability to access justice. And these are what I would say indicators of the empowerment that I'm talking about. The empowerment to be able to access justice, the empowerment, you can change the word, but what I mean is the ability to access justice, the ability to access rights. And if you can do even a little bit to advance that, that is where you are not empowering the community, you are actually empowering yourself. So when I used the term empowerment, what I meant was you are empowering yourself in this whole process of trying to advance or trying to change the lives of certain groups of people, and that is extremely difficult to achieve, because what you do is you are a carrier. You have wandered amongst them, and you take their stories, their narratives in whichever form to inform others. So, when you talk about how to privilege experiences, without victimizing, without making a person victim, but how do you talk about their trauma? How do you make people understand that they have agency? Well, first you have to recognize that trauma is exceptional, but trauma is also a life experience. And so in certain ways, you have to make it important, but you cannot privilege it. That is where your criticality has to come in. It is one of the life experiences. There might be many other experiences that a person has to share with you. So, and the person decides how much that person will share. So the agency you have to recognize is with the interviewee. You cannot subvert that agency. So the whole notion of empowerment is empowerment of the researcher that then goes to sort of advance the questions asked by the people or the communities where the research is taking place. Shalini, I'm done for now.
You're done. So I have a couple of questions more for you, Paula, but Shomita.
Yeah, I just have two comments. One is I agree with Pallavi about the researcher being the field. That I found interesting and, of course, as usual, provocative. But I do disagree with the empowerment question because the empowerment paradigm assumes that existing structures of power continue to be the same, while groups that have so far not had access to structures of power have some kind of access. Uh, from that, and we were talking about this in today's two module sessions. I think Chandra Prasad brought this up, how a lot of refugee action and refugee research and organizations, NGOs, and also people who tried to bring relief to the migrant workers who were caught in the lockdown in India, all of these do not in any way question or challenge the existing systems of inequality. What they do is, to a certain extent, bring succor, to a certain extent, make them access or help them have access to, say, certain kinds of rights, some food, some shelter, some clothing, maybe a monthly sum, which is a pittance actually, but even then. So empowerment in that, and even if this is considered empowering, to be able to flee from a place of, let's say, conflict, or from a place where you are being discriminated against, or from a situation which is extremely hostile to you, to us another situation where you are probably living at the margins of society, but there is no direct threat to you, or your livelihood. It is empowering, but it does not in any way change the unequal system of which you are a part. But the other thing I think, which is the task of the researcher and also task of media practitioners, is there is immense potency in media images, in the spoken word, in the written word, in constantly being able to create a discourse around issues that matter. Migration is something that matters now more than ever before, probably, but it matters. And until and unless it is uh, in the popular domain all the time, and it is in the popular domain, but unfortunately as a threat, until and unless we have images of migrants, images of experiences of migrants, and constant conversation of migrants everywhere, just in the same way we have, images of terrorism or images of threats from migrants everywhere, we can never be able to counter the forces that disempower migrants. So in that sense, the researcher's task and the media practitioner's task, the writer's task, the author's, the poet's task, is in certain way enabling and empowering, but it may not necessarily change everything.
Okay. Paula, you can respond to that in a moment. Let me just give you the second set of questions I have for you. Just maybe one sec. I should not lose this. Yes, here is a question from Vaishali, who is a research scholar at JNU. And her question is, what is your opinion on the methods of research, so both ethical and methodological, and the process of creation of a certain kind of victimized refugee bodies? So we are back to the question of agency and victimhood. How do you think that informs the community itself, the sense.
Shalini, can you repeat the question? I was, it just got,
What is your opinion on the methods of research, both ethical and methodological, on the process of creation of a certain kind of victimized refugee bodies? How do you think that informs the community itself, the sense of giving an identity which might be removed from the actual identities of the people? So that's a question, I think, again, coming back to the question of agency, victimhood. Then from Prabhu, the question, and this probably is for both of you, the suspicion of the archives as contaminated, while the voice of the migrant as simply easily recoverable and unsullied. There is no justification for this position. Do you agree? So this is probably a little bit of a reference to Shamata's idea of looking at migrant memoirs and autoethnographies, but I think imputing an authenticity to them, which you were not imputing at all. But the question is, the suspicion of the archives is contaminated, while the voice of the migrant as simply, easily recoverable and unsullied. There is no justification for this position. Do you agree? Is the question, is simple. Paula seems to suggest that we go to the archives to learn as we do to the knowledge community, but applying the same logic that archives is marred by power, the knowledge community, by the power, the knowledge community. It's an incomplete sentence. What about them? Are they also not contaminated by power? Okay, so the question is, unsullied memoirs, our own work, archives as contaminated by power, but the knowledge community as not contaminated by power. I thought we had agreed to an extent at looking at power as productive and not just as repressive.
Should I respond?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Power and the instrument that it creates is, our lived experiences has shown that it has so much more ability to be repressive than productive. I agree that there might be modes where it can be productive, but when we are talking about a group of disempowered, dispossessed people, then power becomes repressive. And to go back, I will begin with where Shamata ended. Yes, empowering, but I again will say that in this process, we usually empower ourselves and not the community that we're working with. We try to enable them. And, we have to realize that this is a God complex that all of us have. But there is no way out of it. If you want to work with human beings, how can you think that you will not be the catalyst to some change? Otherwise, what is the even point of research? Just bringing out unsullied truth is something that it's not exciting for me as a researcher. And I measure researchers from my own standards. So, because I feel there is no unsullied truth for that matter. And no, Prabhu, you're wrong. I wasn't imputing any sort of truth in either the archives or the knowledge communities that you work with. Because today's knowledge, in fact, in certain ways, the archives where you and me have worked most of our lives, very much we know that these archives are places which has closures. So, how can we say that archives will give us today's knowledge community are the archives of 30 years hence. So, in so much as there is politics in today's knowledge community, in the archives that we go to unearth, in so much as there is constructions in today's knowledge communities, the archives also are constructed. And, that is why we are talking about different kinds of archives today. The traditional definition of archives have changed. And, the question about, victimhood, oh God, I have completely forgotten that question about victimhood of a person. And I'm not saying that a woman violated, or a woman facing trauma, or a woman uh, being beaten up, whatever, is not a victim. But in so much as she is a victim, she's also the agent of her life. And the most that we can do is to be a support system. We cannot change her life. We can be there just to hold hands. We cannot pick up the pieces. But in our narrative, it is important that as a researcher, we have the ability to create narratives. And in that narrative, if we do not, as a researcher, recognize the agency of a person, and yet not look away from the fact that the person is also being victimized for certain forces, then we will not be true to our own research. And it is very, very important that we recognize that all of these experiences happened. There is truth in that, but that person has overcome those experiences. In every action that person has taken, the most important action is to come to a researcher and be agreeable to even discuss the things with the researcher. The first act of standing against those experiences, of confronting those experiences, is the ability to come across and narrate, to recognize and narrate what has happened in your own life, which itself is a very, very difficult experience.
Shomata, and then I have one more specific question to you as well from someone.
I have I actually take exception to words like unsullied and contaminated, because we are assuming there is something which is out there for us to find and to be able to represent faithfully. What is faithful representation? If we believe in representation at all, there is no faithful representation, because representation has its own internal logics, ways of expressing itself, etc. So, and also remember, I am coming from the position of a scholar in cultural studies and literature. Even ethnography and the interviews that we meticulously write down or record and then transcribe are texts to me. We have to read them just as we read somebody's memoir, or we read a piece of fiction, or we read a newspaper article. So the act of reading is ultimately what is producing knowledge for me and producing truth for me. So if contaminated is a word that you would go with, then everything is contaminated. If unsullied is a word that you would go with, then nothing is unsullied. But any act of interpretation and act of representation is not independent of the person who is interpreting and representing. So that is a bind in which we all are. It is good to accept it and then go ahead with it.
Perfect. So then in the same trajectory, you have two questions. Each of you has a question from Biswajit Mohanty, but I think here there are also the same kind of questions of, should I dare say, positivist methodology versus critical ones. So to Paula, the question from Biswajit Mohanty is, if the researcher is the field, then how does one validate a research in terms of its internal and environmental validity and consistency? So it's, again, I think this opposition between a rather positivist methodology in which you want consistency, validity of certain kinds, versus the transgressive norms that you are suggesting for forced migration research. But I would actually say for actually almost all ethnographic research. So I want to force both of you a little bit and press you on what do you think is specific to forced migration research, which is not true of ethnography as a whole, because almost everything which you have said would apply to qualitative, fieldwork-based, critical, participatory methods of research. So I think it might be interesting as a final wrap-up comment from both of you to hear, and it could be that you say there is nothing very specific to forced migration research. The kinds of topics we are discussing now are pedagogical, methodological, ethical issues of all qualitative critical field work-based research. The question to Shaumata from Bishwajit Mohanty: how does one curtail epistemic violence when there is strong resistance at the political and academic circle? Sensitizing does not work as the subaltern has no voice to express itself, he says, but we'll say herself, even if empowered to do so. So I think we have this in both the questions, the same kind of query about critical methodologies versus positivist ones. And then I said, as I would like a final wrap-up comment from you on if you think there is anything very specific to forced migration as an object of research itself, which is different from doing critical ethnography on anything else.
Shaumata, you want to go first or what?
I'll go first. And you can have the final word from the two of us.
Shalini will have the final word.
Yeah, so that's why I said from the two of us. Then Shalini gets to say more. Okay, first I'll take Bishwajit's question, and I will talk about this. We were teaching histories of partition texts, and I was teaching from a set syllabus that have been set by people who are not me. I only chose to offer that course and engage with the students. In that, we do not have a single narrative which has any Dalit voice. And the reason behind that is, for the longest time, partition literature did not include Dalit voices. It is only after the 1990s that Dalit memoirs of the partition have been written. Now, to 2000 and 2010 onwards, there are so many Dalit memoirs, Dalit women's memoirs, which have come out in Bangla, but I am assuming would be the same case for Punjab as well. So it is true that we think that the subaltern does not have anything, any voice, but within the existing academic sphere, within publishing industries, within refugee memoirs, within partition literature, there is a strong field which is emerging. Of course, it took it 70 years to emerge, but it did emerge. And now that we have it, again, we are fixing syllabi in such a manner that such texts don't have a space. But then that is where I, as a migration researcher, should come in, and a teacher should come in, that should make it a point that those texts have their space, their legitimate and long due space. I don't know whether we can still undo the epistemic violence which has been done by keeping them outside, but such is the problem with most of canonical, everything that has become canonicized. This is a long fight. My course that other people 2 generations ahead of me have set does not have those texts. I am aware that this is a lacuna. Hopefully, sometime in the future, I will address it. Maybe my students will do so much better, and their courses will, from the moment of its inception, be so much stronger in representing everything and all sorts of subaltern and marginalized voices. So that's the first thing. And in terms of ethnography, I both agree and disagree that there is nothing special about forced migration research, which is not to be found in all forms of qualitative and ethnographic research. Yes, all the concerns that we have flagged should be the concerns in every ethnography and should be something that every ethnographer is dealing with. But in forced migration and refugee context, we are also talking about, and this comes in from some of the questions that were addressed towards Nasreen, we are also talking about trauma, of violence, of victimhood, of helplessness. A collection of Bengali partition stories is called The Trauma and the Triumph. Not every other situation in which we do our ethnography, and I know that because my first ethnography was among people who go and work out at a fitness museum, fitness center. So they have only triumph, no trauma for some time. What I'm trying to say then is that ethnography does not deal with the same kind of trauma, triumph, violence, helplessness, and being in a certain sense, subjects of historical currents in which subject in the sense of subjectification, not subjecthood, of historical currents in which one does not have adequate amount of control. That probably keeps forced migration research away from every other ethnography that we are used to. This is my submission.
Okay, thank you. Paula.
Yeah. Uh, Bishwajit, I hate binaries. I never thrived in binaries. I'm always, in my own mind, I'm always complicating things. And I think this is where criticality comes in. From who are you seeking validation? If you are doing the research, who is your audience where you want validation from? And why would you want validation from anybody? The fact that you're doing your research is validation enough. I mean, what other validation, that you might want accreditation, but what kind of validation are we looking for? I mean, even accreditation is for a specific purpose. So I don't believe that, you have to seek validation. And because most often when you are researcher, at least the stage that I'm in my life now, I thankfully, I don't have to seek validation. So when I do a research, I validate it. And if I can't validate it, then there's no point in doing that research. So for me, it is a false problematic, very frankly. Okay. Now, in terms of, I was thinking about Shalini's question for a long time because I gave a lecture in the anthropology department. And, this question is recurring. But there is one difference, that Shomata hinted on, and I will very clearly talk about it. And that is, as I said, whenever we are doing research, we are freezing a moment of truth. And here we are dealing with people who are mobile, whose movement is systematically, institutionally opposed. So, the erasure of, of that group is the most important thing that we fight against. Unless the community of researchers or media community talked about Rohingya issue or Syrian refugee, how do we know that there is a crisis of migration in Europe? Who tells us there is a crisis of migration in Europe? If the state has its say, the state will represent as an issue of legality. But it is the researcher that have translated it into so many other research, including the issue of respect, the issue of honor, and the issue of transgressions for that honor. So, we as a researcher primarily bear witness. We as a researcher are able to bring it into the discourse. So, that is why I think we are extremely privileged. And that is why we also fall into that problem where we think that we are playing God. And we try to appropriate a certain sense of power, which is actually not there. And that is the end of our research when we think that that's what we are doing. We have to constantly push ourselves into thinking that the only job that we can do is that of an interlocutor. And as an interlocutor, we can try to maybe change some facets of communities' life by popularizing a certain viewpoint, a critical viewpoint, and an empowering viewpoint. That's all.
Thank you very much. I've just been reminded from the CRG desk that we are transgressing on trespassing on other people's time and your break. So I'm not going to give a large concluding word. I wanted to draw you out on the very specifics of forced migration research and critical, both ethnography and textual and documentary film readings. And I think the last comments show what is very specific, what is general to this critical research methodology and pedagogy, but also what is very specific to the field of forced migration research. Thank you, both of you, and thank you, Nasreen, in absentia, for a really fascinating discussion on a wide-ranging set of issues. I think we're going to continue this discussion in the other panels. So, and thank all of you greatly. We've had between 47 and some 50 plus audience who has been following the discussion and writing us questions as well. So thanks to all of you for having stayed with us this afternoon. And I look forward to joining you in some of the other panels. So thanks very, very much. Bye.
Thank you, Madam Moderator and Chair.
My pleasure.
You.
Thanks. Bye.